Hi everybody, welcome to class. Let me get things up here and we'll get started. Voila. So let's give this a try and we'll see how things go. I'll try to keep this under 40 minutes. We'll see. Here I'm timing myself. Great. So Monday, March 23rd, we're going to talk about gifts exchange and reciprocity. I wanted to take the first couple minutes to talk about how we're going to be running the class online. So first of all, I'm doing these classes from my kitchen. So here's a selfie of me in the kitchen on the computer. So please be kind and be patient. I'm doing the best I can to get class to you in an interesting way. And I hope that the discussion boards work well also. So here it goes. So I sent out last week a revised syllabus to the class. As you can see, it hasn't changed radically. We're still doing most of the readings that were already on, but I did try to put in a few movies and a few other sorts of things to stimulate discussion. In any case, that revised syllabus did go out and it's also up on Blackboard. So as always, as when you were all in Paris, you do the readings before, in this case, watching the class. There'll also be films and podcasts later on. For each class, then I'll upload one of these commented PowerPoints to the YouTube channel I opened up for this reason. At the end of each PowerPoint, you'll find some questions that you need to discuss with your group. So please get online with your group after reading and watching and then discuss. If you can post the main points from your discussion on the Blackboard discussion board, and there's a small note here. I'm not sure that this is the most user-friendly or most adaptable tool for what we'd like to do. So if groups have ideas for other ways they'd like to share their discussion with the class, please let me know. I'm open to other ideas as well. Okay? I'll also try to hold Zoom meetings at class time, at least for the Paris group, if the Paris group is interested in doing so, to meet and talk about the readings. Anyone's free to join. I guess I'll send out a Zoom invite for those. And we can always have a discussion and share a discussion with the class to ask questions and so on and so forth. So based on our last class when we were all together, I have these as the groups. Group 1, Addie, Amanda, and Jenna. Group 2, Gigi, Genevieve, Lexi. 3 is Dara, Ryan, and Sean. 4 is Avi, Claudia, and Olivia. 5, Anna, Liz, Maddie, Natalie. I don't know where you ended up and if the East Coast group is still okay with you. Sophia, I think you're in New York now, so you might want to join that group. Group 6, Maria and Laura. And then group 7 here in Paris is Giselle, Malia, Sophie, and Linnea. And I'm here, of course, too. Shelby, if you could let us know what group you'd like to be a part of and what time zone you're in right now. Feel free to make up some group names for your groups. Number groups are a bit boring, so if you'd like to make up a name, please do so. As you can see on your revised syllabus, I decided not to try to maintain the Black Crow quizzes. This would have taken an awful lot of work setting up multiple choice quizzes in Blackboard, and I'm already having a hard time keeping up with these PowerPoints and the online discussions and so on and so forth. So we will freeze the Black Crow quizzes where we ended them halfway, so midterm. That will count as 10% of your final grade. And then I'd like for the other 15% of that, of what would have been the Black Crow quizzes, to be a field note writing exercise. This will largely be a complete incomplete grade, meaning that I'll calculate it as an A as long as you do it. Okay? I'm not, voila, we can talk more about that as we go along if you have questions. So I'd like you to try to keep an anthropologist field note journal over the upcoming weeks. I'm thinking 4 pages, type double space per week is a nice minimum. That means 1 page a day for at least 4 days during a week. So we'll start this Monday, March 23rd, and we'll either end with the quarantine or end by April 11th. So that would be 3 weeks of notes in case the quarantine ends up going past that. If some of you really get involved in this exercise and you do journals that are extensively longer than that and quite in depth, then I am happy to give some extra credit for those as well. Really what I'd like you to try to do in these notes is try your hand at writing thick descriptions, right, of everyday experiences like anthropologists do, of the COVID that should read 19 experience. It's actually a really excellent opportunity for field work because it is a new human experience, at least in our lifetimes, and we're all living specific and individual kinds of experiences of it, but I think there's also probably some common sorts of shared experiences and ideas, perhaps rituals that are developing, and so on and so forth. To help write effective ethnographic notes or thick description, right? Because I don't want it to be simply a personal diary. This is quite different when you do field note writing. One of the things you need to be mindful of are the different kinds of language you need to integrate into your notes. Of course, most of your notes are going to be written by you, so it's your language as the researcher, right? And we need to be mindful of that. We try with our thick descriptions when we're carefully describing what's happening around us, right? What kinds of activities, what kinds of actors, what kinds of spaces are being used, what kinds of interactions are happening. And those, I would say, are the more objective aspect of field note writing when we try to describe thickly what is happening. Of course, as we have talked about in class several times, the experience of field work is also deeply emotional, and so can involve all sorts of subjective feelings and ideas. And we need to note those as well, but we always are mindful to note those apart. Our own experiences or judgments or interpretations in situ, we should try to guard separately or keep separate. We try to integrate informant's language, so that could be, I don't know, in this case, if it's COVID, it could be conversations we're having with people we're quarantined with. It could be conversations or emails or exchanges or chats online with various people. It could be things we're reading in the newspaper. So it's the language of others involved in whatever experience it is we're looking at. Then there's, of course, and this one you don't have to worry about as much because you're not seasoned anthropologists, but the longer you study and work as an anthropologist, the more and more you kind of develop a battery of anthropological concepts that can kind of work their way into your notes. And you have to always be mindful to keep your analysis or your interpretation also separate from the description. So I just want you to take notes, being mindful of these different sorts of languages and keeping them somewhat apart. I generally mark informant's words by making sure I put them in quotations and saying who was saying what. If it's a subjective reaction to a particular activity, for example, I write it in a separate paragraph as a subjective aside. Analytical language, I also put in a separate paragraph as an analytical aside. If you would like, but by all means you do not need to, if you'd like to see a discussion of these different languages and how to work them into field notes, you can always check out my PowerPoint that I put together for the AN1002. That's the Anthropology of Cities class on this YouTube channel. I put the link here below. So just keep in mind that field notes are not an exact science. I see them more as a craft, which you need to practice, right? With the idea of developing your abilities to observe, to self-reflect, potentially apply concepts, to ask anthropological questions and gain a deeper understanding of an event. All right? So please, you can either put questions below in the comments section below this video. You could pool your questions with your discussion group and then share them on the discussion board. I will be sure to get to the questions either in the next PowerPoint or by email. I'll see how many I have. All right. So most of this lecture is going to be focus on key concepts and works as they were discussed in Henry's chapter on gift exchange and reciprocity. So I'd like to discuss first Marcel Maus's The Gift, published in English in 1925, I think a few years earlier in French. A really important work in this realm of anthropology. And of course, I guess I should say before we even move on to Mauss is that if we're studying gift exchange and reciprocity, it's because exchanging and gift giving is a human universal, right? In all human societies, people exchange services, objects, words, so on and so forth. And every time we exchange, there's different kinds of meanings that are expressed or circulating, right? Social relations being built or deconstructed. So it's a really important realm and a very old realm of anthropological inquiry. Generally, when we actually have classes in Paris, what I do for this class is I bring in a present all wrapped up with a pretty bow and I give it to someone in class and I ask them to open it. And it's usually a very uncomfortable sort of experience because they don't know why the professor is bringing in a present, why this particular person is getting a present, why they're supposed to open it. And so the Black Crow quiz then is usually given to explain what was your reaction to this and why was your reaction such, right? What kinds of expectations do we have around gift giving as humans and what sorts of things are meant by it, right? In any case, let's talk a little bit about Marcel Mauss. So, he was born in 1872 in the Vosges, actually, in the mountains in the east of France, up by Alsace. Passed away in 1950. He was actually the nephew of Emile Durkheim and trained with Durkheim. You'll remember that we spoke about Emile Durkheim earlier in the semester, I think in the first or second class, as the father of French sociology and to some extent anthropology. So Marcel Mauss was his student and nephew, and if memory serves right, I believe he was the only student that survived World War I as well. So Marcel Mauss becomes a very renowned French sociologist and anthropologist in his own right. I guess in France he's most often recognized as the father of French anthropology. He was the founder of the Ethnography Institute at the University of Paris. He was a political activist and aligned himself in the Third Republic with Jean Jaurès, for those of you who know a bit about French history. And his work will go on and influence folks like Claude Lévi-Strauss. You guys read his Culinary Triangle earlier in the semester. Radcliffe Brown, who you know is one of the founders of structural functionalism. Evans Pritchard, okay, another British anthropologist. So he writes this book called The Gift, The Form and Reason for Exchange in Archaic Societies, published in 1925. In French, the title is Essai sur le don, forme et raison de l'échange dans les sociétés archaïques. He's still working, as you can tell from the title, a bit within a social evolutionist frame, with the idea that by studying societies that are considered primitive in some way, in this case archaic, we're able to understand something about our past. Though, as we'll see, much of the analysis that so he's focusing here largely on non-capitalist societies. He looks at exchange in Melanesia, Polynesia, North America. He's using the works of others, so we could consider it an example of armchair anthropology. He's doing cross-cultural comparison, right? He's looking at several societies and trying to understand what was happening around exchange in these pre-monetary societies, right? Of course, if it's such an impactful book, it's because much of what he finds happening in these quote-unquote archaic societies turn out in many ways to be kinds of human universals and help people to think through exchange in many sorts of places afterwards. Mauss is interested in particular in the gift as something that looks voluntary, right? We often give and receive gifts as something that is given freely. but is actually, in Mose's idea, or in Mose's observations, obligatory. Okay. Gift exchange is also, for Marcel Mauss, what he calls a total social phenomenon. In other words, an act like gift exchange involves simultaneous expression of religion, legal, moral, and an economic nature. In other words, gift exchange is an extremely valuable window onto this kind of holistic view of the ways these different institutions are interwoven and interact with one another, right? Any kind of gift exchange is going to tell us something about a society's religious institutions, legal structures, morality or ideas about right and wrong, economics systems, and so on and so forth. Gift exchange is not, he's once again, as with anthropology, always, we're not first and foremost interested in the individual, but interested in groups and interested in that which we share. And gift exchanges as well, for Marcel Mauss, is often done between whole groups, right? In the societies he's studying at the time, this is done through their chiefs, and it may not only involve goods, wealth, and property, but also courtesies, entertainment, ritual, military assistance, women, children, dances, feasts that should read, and so on and so forth. He referred to these as total prestation in French, prestations, I guess we'd say in English. So these exchanges between whole groups, and they are, again, in theory, voluntary, but are strictly obligatory, and indeed can result in various kinds of sanctions, such as private sanctions or even open warfare when they're not carried through. Marcel Mauss is very well known for coming up and developing this idea of the three obligations associated with the gift. The obligations are to give, to receive, and to repay. And I think you can think about any kind of gift-giving, ceremonial gift-giving event in your life and see how these may apply, right? And here I put a picture of my son at one of his birthday parties when he was littler. I think he was turning 5 here, and now he's turning 14. But a birthday party is something that many of you know and have experienced. And of course, there is an obligation to give. If you are one of these little children and you're invited to Alex's birthday party, if you don't bring a present, it says something about your relationship to Alex, or it says something about your family's morality, or it says something, right? It would be expected to bring a gift. It is accepted or expected that Alex should receive the present, and there's all kinds of codes and rules about receiving properly. And indeed, when your child is very young, you often socialize them into proper reception of a gift, right? They're not supposed to open it and throw it over their shoulder and not pay attention to it or give it back and say, I don't like it. So we socialize them into proper ways of gift giving and gift receiving. And then, of course, the other obligation associated with the gift is to repay, that there's always some form of repayment that is expected or entailed. Now, in this case, it may very well be that Alex will be invited to one of these children's birthday parties later on in the year, and he will in turn give a gift of his own, and so the cycle of obligations is met. Now, you may take a little time to discuss with your group all the ways, all the gifts, exchanges that you've been involved with that in some way involve these obligations. You can play around with them in a lot of ways, but they often work, right? If you go to the market in France, the vendors try to give you free strawberries, for example, or, well, not these days, but generally giving out samples is something, right? It's a gift. And yet we know, and we often feel obliged to take a bit, but we also know that the unstated repayment there is about then buying something from the vendor, right? One of the examples sometimes used in class is students bring up, what do you do when you're in a bar and someone offers you a drink, right? They're giving, you may receive, but the question that's open then once again is what repayment is expected, or what repayment do I decide to give, right? So this is a kind of frame or a series of, a frame of obligations, I guess, in which we can think through a lot of gift-giving situations. Now, Mose also looked at the Kula exchange, and this was something that was first analyzed by Malinowski. So it's a system of ceremonial gift giving in the Trobriand Islands, quite complex gift giving. And here you see on the left hand side a map from Malinowski's book on the Trobriand Islanders called The Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And you see, well, you can't see very well, but you see the different islands that belong to the Trobriand Islands, and the lines that you see are tracing out the direction and the routes of exchange, right? They built ceremonial canoes at specific times of the years, and sometimes the travel was quite dangerous. And a series of necklaces or surava traveled in one direction and moved from group to group, and they had stories attached to them and statuses attached to them. And a series of armbands traveled in another. So, quite an involved system of exchange that seemed to have no necessarily important utilitarian purpose, although Malinowski did note that utilitarian objects also did move with these more cherished necklaces and armbands. Um, but the point that Moss makes in his book is that the kula is just one example that demonstrates that ceremonial gift exchange is an important means to ensure communication, right? And in the Trobriand Islands at the time that Malinowski and most might be thinking about them, this would be ensuring communication among people who were otherwise quite separated, right, on different kinds of islands. And that these gifts became ways of expressing and maintaining and communicating social relations. Um, and you can think of all sorts of other instances in which gift giving also acts as an important means of communication and an important means of expressing social relations. I saw that on the academic premiere video via the AUP library portal that there's an old ethnographic film from 1952 on the Trobriand Islands, and there's about 20 minutes on the Kula Exchange, actually, and it starts at minute 32. I gave the link here if you were ever interested in watching it. It's quite an old film, yet at the same time, it gives you a little bit of an idea um, of what this quite renowned ethnographic example looked like. And I do believe while I was researching for this PowerPoint, that Kula exchange continues to take place in various sorts of ways, though it's not a society I know much about. So you could always look up, if you wanted to, the various kinds of ways that Kula has continued. The other example that Henry brings to mind and that Mose talks about in his book when he turns to Polynesia, and he looks particularly at the Maori people, a little bit at the Samoan people as well, and he uses the notions of mana and taonga in these places to think about the force of the obligations that are associated with gift giving. So he introduces us to this notion of mana, which among the Maori is about the kind of honor or prestige that a person builds up over time, which is referred to as mana. And which is conferred by wealth, but lost if suitable gifts are not returned. So mana is lost when a gift is not returned. Mana also includes a kind of spiritual or magical element that's transmitted through the vehicle of taonga, which may be property, labor, or merchandise that has the power to turn and destroy the recipient if appropriate repayment is not made. Right? So a taonga might be some kind of object, it might be some sort of merchandise that will destroy its recipient if the recipient didn't repay or reciprocate for that object, right? And one of the important points that Moss makes here is that gifts always carry a part of the giver to them, with them, and in various kinds of ways. We might talk about a magical or spiritual element, but often when we think about gift giving in a range of societies, both past and present, there is some essence of a giver attached to the gift itself, right? And this is meaningful in all sorts of ways and in different sorts of contexts. I also saw that mana and taonga are terms that continue to have meaning for many of the folks, many of Maorians, for example, and you can always look online and see the various ways that those are still used and thought about. The last term that that at least we'll focus on from Mose's work, but um, which is also a very well-known concept in anthropology, is the term potlatch. Potlatch is apparently a Chinook word that means nourish or to consume, but it was a term used to describe competitive feasts held in mostly the Pacific Northwest of America, and apparently are still held to some extent, though they've changed quite a bit from what I've understood from uh, their original form, which Mose talks about in his book. And these were competitive feasts that different tribes participated in. A chief from one tribe would invite others, would offer a lavish feast, would offer gifts, and it was basically the chief that offered the highest or the most expensive, that would rise in the political hierarchy in the region, right? So these competitive feasts were ways in the region among these tribes to establish a political hierarchy, right? Years later, actually, an American sociologist named Thorstein Veblen, he's writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He publishes a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, and he's publishing this during the American Gilded Age. So at a time when um, when the inequalities, wealth disparities, that we know today were active at this time as well. But the money here was being produced by railroad barons, for example, Rockefellers, Carnegies. And one of the things that Veblen was interested in at the time was the leisure classes, so the wealthy, and the ways in which they displayed and performed their wealth and status. And he invented this term called conspicuous consumption, right? And this has to do with preference for a good because it's expensive, and the display of that item, or usually those items, right, as a way to project status and standing. So here is one picture that I found on the internet, from the Gilded Age, and you can very easily see all sorts of signs of conspicuous consumption, right? From the chandeliers to the tuxedos to the dining room table, and so on and so forth. So these are ways for the leisure class to establish hierarchical boundaries, to promote their own status, to establish moral good as well, um, and so on and so forth. So conspicuous consumption, many ways a kind of extension of a potlatch idea that was explored earlier by Marcel Mauss. Henry talks a little bit about instances in the ethnographic record where the obligation of to give, to receive, and repay isn't in play. She refers to this work by Gloria Raheja, and she explores the caste system in India and looks in particular at a gift known as Dan or Dana. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, actually. And this is a gift that's made to priests or members of a different caste, usually an inferior caste, who can deal with residual pollution. So the idea is that these gifts are given as a kind of purification to attach, and a sin is attached to the gift, is given in a ceremonial gift giving exchange to a priest, for example, and should certainly not be repaid because it's a way of purifying oneself and by giving away, right, that which the person or the spirit should no longer have. So that was just one exception to Moses, and there certainly are others, but this is one example that Henry brought up and that I thought I would bring to your attention as well. The last thing I'd like to bring to your attention from Henry's chapter is she references briefly Marshall Sahlins' work. He wrote an article in 1974 on the sociology of primitive exchange. I'm realizing now I perhaps should have put I should have put, maybe I'll include it in the next slideshow, a brief biography of Marshall Solins. Once again, a very important anthropologist, still living, worked most of his career, I believe, at the University of Chicago. And I'll include a brief bio in the next slideshow. In any case, in this article, he identifies three types of reciprocity, and he thinks about reciprocity and its relationship to social distance, right? Uh, and so, to some extent, I guess this is another sort of theory that offers a different kind of view from the obligatory system that most originally offered. Right? So Marshall Solins talks about generalized reciprocity, balanced reciprocity, and negative reciprocity. He tells us that these are ideal types, of course, that in practice and everyday life, they probably don't exist in such a clear-cut and well-defined fashion, and that we should probably think about them as kind of on a spectrum rather as distinct boxes, right? So generalized reciprocity for Solins is about showing strong solidarity. It's about expressing close relations. Right? Generally, there's no return stipulated. There's no definite obligation to return. Right? So you might imagine generalized reciprocity being practiced within a family unit, a nuclear family unit, for example, in your life. Your mother, I don't know, gives you some small gift in some small way and doesn't expect you to return that. There's no definite obligation linked to it, and so on. So it's showing strong ties. Right? Balanced reciprocity. So this is when goods of equal worth pass immediately between two parties, right? With no time lag, with no moral implications, right? About what's right or wrong in terms of the exchange. This is often in the realm of economic transactions in a market system, right? I might go to the supermarket across the street, buy a loaf of bread, give the money expected for that loaf of bread, get the loaf of bread, and leave. Right? This would be one example of what he terms balanced reciprocity. And then you have negative reciprocity, which is the attempt to get something for nothing, right? Towards the advantage of only one party. And this can take all kinds of forms. Obviously, the most obvious form would be theft, but it can take other forms as well, right? This Solins is going to argue is carried out with people who are very socially distant from us, right? So it usually marks great social distance. Now, this might be actual physical distance, but it might be actual social class difference or other kinds of difference, right? Now, here to the left, I put a copy of the diagram that's in Marshall Solins' article that of the kinds of circles, concentric circles, the one inside the other, that show the spectrum, with generalized reciprocity being in the house, so being in the close knit social relations, balanced reciprocity moving out in terms of social distance, and then negative reciprocity with social relations laying outside of those sectors, right? Now, Solins, once again, he may have been looking at forms of primitive exchange, quote unquote, so these sorts of things happening in pre-monetary or pre-industrial sorts of societies, but thinks about all the kinds of ways that this works in contemporary society as well, right? So that we can imagine balanced exchange as being the typical sort of exchange in a market economy, but that in actual trading situations, social factors are actually hard to eliminate. And if someone is socially close or socially distant, can often play and determine market relations and market exchanges, right? And he discusses as well this idea that the capitalist world is full of people trying to make something out of other people, and social distance is invariably then a factor, right? Which may or may not have anything to do with geographical distance. But certainly we can think in all sorts of ways, the ways in which global capital or global capital exchanges take advantage of certain populations over others, and so on and so forth. So there's ways of expanding this and thinking about, and we'll return to some of these questions later when we talk about globalization and transnationalism and things like this in a later class. Okay, so just a couple slides left. I'd like you, and it looks like I'm pretty much on time here. I have a couple ideas for a discussion group. So once again, go back to the beginning of the slide here. You have, you're arranged in discussion groups by time zones. I have 2 themes that I'd like you to discuss, and then I'd like you to report back, either in writing or some other means, but you need to report back to the group in some way, okay? So theme 1, gift giving on the Big Bang Theory. I happened to come across 2 excerpts on YouTube of an episode of the Big Bang Theory that involves gift exchange. So you see them at the bottom of the slide. The first part of the episode is in the Big Bang Theory gift giving 1, and I have the YouTube link there. The second one, and it's from the same episode, it's just the end of the episode, is Sheldon and Penny exchange presents. That's the second part. These both last a minute or 2. So if you could watch those, please. And then with your groups, why don't you talk about how some of the concepts and the theories we learned in this chapter apply to the episode, right? How do the writers of the series use gift exchange theory in the episode to shape the episode? Drawing from the gift exchange theory and concepts we just talked about, why is Penny's gift to Sheldon so meaningful, right? Explain Sheldon's gifts that he returns to Penny. Why does he give the gifts that he does, and what gifts does he give? And why is the episode funny? The episode is obviously written to be really funny, and it's using some of the unspoken associations with gift exchange to do that. So think a little bit about that and discuss it with your group. The second theme I'd like you to discuss with your group has to do with your second reading. So I gave you another reading called The Anthropology of Giving Towards a Cultural Logic of Charity. I thought this was an interesting article because it's not written by an anthropologist, but it's written, John Hansen is the author. He's not an anthropologist. He's actually a director of philanthropy for a very large organization in Chicago. You can find his LinkedIn page, his professional LinkedIn page, if you want to know a bit more about him. But what I thought was interesting here was that he uses anthropological concepts, and many of them, these very classic texts, most in particular he draws from, but also from Veblen, and so on and so forth. And he uses them to think through contemporary philanthropy culture in the United States in a critical manner. So I thought it was an interesting example of applying anthropology and anthropological concepts to a contemporary context by someone who is a professional in that context and not an anthropologist. So if you could just discuss with your group how he applies, which concepts does he apply, and how does he apply them, right, to the contemporary culture of charity or philanthropy in the United States. So be sure to identify the concepts, right? Give me a little bit of detail. Identify the concepts and what kind of argument is he making about philanthropic culture in the United States today through those concepts? What sorts of things is he thinking through, right? And what sorts of critiques is he making? And then I'd like you to also think about, if you were to send an email to John Hansen, what sorts of questions would you want to ask him about his article? What sorts of questions would you maybe want to ask him about his interest in anthropology? What sorts of questions might appeal to you or might be important to you? All right, that's it. So please get in your discussion groups and send along your ideas. Thanks. Bye.